What I'd like to do is just read the article together and then make some comments. And feel free at any time to interject your own thoughts here in the discussion. So, content, this is content derived from Jesus on Every Page, Reasons to Study Your Old Testament by David Murray. Found this article on the Gospel Coalition website. First reason he offers is the Old Testament reveals Christ. The Old Testament doesn't just point forward to Christ, it reveals Him. It isn't merely a series of signposts to Christ. His revealing shadow falls on every page, exciting faith and love in believers' hearts, in believing hearts. But why linger in the Old Testament shadows when we have New Testament sunlight? That's a relevant question, isn't it? Yep. Why look so hard for Jesus in the Old Testament if He's so apparent in the New Testament? Have you never found it easier to read and be refreshed in the shade? Have you never admired the unique and wondrous beauty of the dawn? Consider the unparalleled revelation of Christ's substitutionary atonement in Isaiah 53. And although the Gospels describe Christ's outer life, the messianic Psalms disclose His mysterious inner life, the unfathomably deep emotional and mental struggles of His earthly suffering. So he poses a good question, a question that a naysayer might push back against. Why do all this study in the Old Testament? We can just readily see Jesus in the New Testament. Now, some of these reasons would bolster the argument that we should look in the Old Testament. But one there is it gives us another side of the diamond, right? Another slice that we don't necessarily get in the New Testament. But also, when we talk about how the Old Testament reveals Christ, we could say a few things. One would be direct prophecy. Some of those that come to mind is like, mentioned here, Isaiah 53, but the prophecy of the coming Messiah. Even all the way back, and I'm going to be operating off memory, so have some grace with me. Even when God said that Eve's offspring, her heel would be bruised, and the serpent's head, so to speak, would be hurt and damaged. So even from early on in Genesis, we see foreshadow, prophecy, if you will, of Jesus Christ. Also, not only that, in the Old Testament, we see types, that's a word we might use, or pictures of Jesus. Now, the one that really quickly comes to my mind is the Passover lamb. Isn't that just a beautiful picture of the shed blood of the lamb being applied to the doorpost and the death angel passing over and that household being saved or redeemed, we might say? Isn't Jesus the slain lamb, and His blood, so to speak, is the atoning blood applied to us so that we can be redeemed to God? So there are those pictures. Also, by the way, Jonathan Edwards, you'll know him from church history. He argued that there's liberty to make, there's liberty to see types and pictures of Jesus that aren't explicitly referred to in the New Testament. And I would tend to agree with that. So, lots of discussion we'll get into in the future on that. Can anybody else think of some foreshadows or types or pictures that they think of readily when it comes to the Old Testament pointing to Jesus?
Well, I think of like with the Levitical laws, like having to sacrifice a lamb.
Yeah.
They, for the sins, they either, were going to commit, didn't commit, kind of thing. They had to do that.
That's right.
Every day.
So even the law pictures the idea of a sacrificial lamb for the atonement of sin. That is a picture and a foreshadow, although not good enough, ultimately.
Right.
That's why Jesus had to come, but that's definitely a picture that we see of Jesus in the Old Testament. What about Jonah? Has anybody ever thought of that? I think Jesus might have even referred to Jonah in reference to himself, to be raised on the third day. Even Israel, the nation of Israel itself, being a picture. There in Matthew, we see that Jesus wanders for 40 years and 40 days in the wilderness to overcome temptation, whereas Jesus is the perfected, so to speak, Israel. Israel wanders for 40 years and does not necessarily overcome temptation. So, when it comes to revealing Christ, we see it in direct prophecy, we see it in foreshadow, and we see it in types and pictures of foreshadowing the coming Christ. Secondly, this one is really interesting to me. Anybody have any more thoughts to contribute here in a general sense before we move on?
This one kind of falls under types, but we see three primary roles in the Old Testament, which only Christ fulfilled, right? We see prophet, priest, and king. These three roles that throughout time God works through times through prophets, as we saw even this morning, through priests and then through kings. But we see no one person fulfills each of those roles perfectly until Christ, right?
Man, that's really good. The three roles that Christ perfectly fulfilled, we see in the Old Testament, those being the roles of prophet, priest, and king. One man in the Old Testament, each of these, but Jesus fulfilled them all. So what I'm hearing Ryan say is we can go back and look at those prophetic, priestly, and kingly roles and then see a picture in totality of Jesus, Him being the completeness, fulfillment, imperfection of all of those. Man, isn't that good? That's encouraging to me. So second, anybody else? Secondly, David Murray here suggests that the Old Testament provides us a dictionary of sorts of Christian vocabulary. Now, didn't we see that this morning in the sermon some? For example, this morning we spoke of the doctrine of God in some ways. God is sovereign. God is merciful. God is redeeming. God is loving. God is just. He is the righteous judge, right? We saw all of those elements, didn't we, in that story? All of those doctrines, but instead of it being stated, we can witness those doctrines in story form. We can witness those doctrines in the Old Testament. Each of those doctrines I just suggested are new. I don't even like to make the distinction, but as we typically understand it, they are New Testament Christian doctrines that we see evident in the Old Testament. So I would say this. Let's just list a few of these. Doctrines concerning God. I would even say His character, His sovereignty. All of those are evident in the Old Testament. Isn't God's love and redemption desire toward man evident? And He is the just judge, the righteous judge. You know this is really cool. God says this of Himself multiple times. He says, I am a jealous God. He desires for us to be wholly and completely set apart unto Him to be His. And by the way, He'll go at great lengths to achieve this, sending His own Son to die. What about this one? We already stated it. The doctrine of the Messiah, the doctrine of Jesus, is evident in the Old Testament. There's tons and tons of doctrines that we see evident in the Old Testament. Wouldn't you agree that often, especially here in contemporary American churches, we think, well, the Old Testament's that irrelevant part of the Bible way back there that really doesn't even apply to us today. Don't we kind of? And sometimes we'll even say those words. Somebody will quote a scripture and someone might say, yeah, but that's from the Old Testament, that doesn't apply today. I hope through this study we see that that's not necessarily true. Now, this is a longer discussion for another day. In fact, we'll get into it on this next point. Ryan, anybody else have a comment, thought to talk about when we talk about, in a sense, the Old Testament can give us a dictionary of sorts when it comes to Pam's point earlier. How clearer of a definition of atonement can we get than looking at the Old Testament sacrificial ceremonial law. Without the shedding of blood, there cannot be redemption or atonement for sin. We would say those exact words when it comes to Jesus. He had to die, substitutionary atonement, die in our stead so that we could be redeemed. There is a beautiful, beautiful picture of that doctrine in the Old Testament. Anything else?
Well, I think we're talking about vocabulary. You know, in some of my English courses that I teach, we read things from maybe 100, 200, 300 years ago. And we have to go learn a whole new vocabulary. The students will tell me, I don't know what those words mean, or the meanings have changed, you know, kind of thing. So it's relevant for us to go back in time to look at that, you know, literature from those eras, you know, in order and understand what they're saying and relate it to us now,
Very
kind of
good.
thing. It's the same thing with going back and reading the Old Testament to relate it to what's going on now.
And more to her point, to bolster her point, when the New Testament was written, it was written through the lens of Old Testament Scripture. When they used those words, they were using them in the sense they were used in the Old Testament. So to fully grasp Paul's take on justification, substitutionary atonement, all of those concepts, he would have been thinking in terms of the Old Testament. You know, covenant, Messiah, Redeemer, all of the, God being the righteous judge, all these things, sanctification. Man, very good point. To best understand the vocabulary of the New Testament, we have to go back to the Old Testament, don't we? That is excellent. Very, very good. So, let's continue, unless somebody has something else to add here. Yes, ma'am?
Well, there's a few words in here that are good for you to define so I can understand what you've read a little bit better.
Okay, is this under which number?
Under the first one.
All right, can we do that afterwards? Would that be okay? I'll spend some time with you if you'd like that. Very good question, by the way. I'm glad you're engaged that way. I didn't read the second one there, but let's read the third one together. The Old Testament is a manual for Christian living. While there is understandable debate over the continuing validity of a small percentage of Old Testament laws, there are 10 clear and unchanging moral principles that God applies in different ways in different contexts. To Israel in the wilderness, Exodus 20, to Israel about to enter the promised land, Deuteronomy 5, and to Israel settled in the land, Proverbs. Jesus and the apostles continued this varied cultural application of these same 10 moral principles for their own generation, Matthew 5, Ephesians 5. All these examples provide models for how to think about and apply these moral principles in our day. Does anybody know what he's referring to here? The Ten Commandments, that Decalogue, we call it. So, let's think about this. A manual for Christian living. Now, we would never say that the Old Testament is a manual for Christian living. Now, this is where the tension comes. Now, this is going to be fascinating working through this. I want you to notice this. In the Old Testament, the Mosaic Law, we have the ceremonial law as part of that. Also, we have this. Civil law. And then finally we have this. Moral law. Now, this will be a fascinating study later. Ceremonial law has to do with being clean or unclean. How do we cleanse a leper? Ceremonially. How do we cleanse our garments? Ceremonially. How do we sacrifice animals appropriately? How do we sprinkle the blood exactly how the priests need to over the altar and burn and consume later and discard the remains? All of that has to do with this ceremonial law that took place in and around the temple, right? We talked about that this morning. Now, what people want to say is, well, New Testament Christians aren't really beholden to that type ceremonial law. Is that true or false? I hope you think it's true. We have no need to sacrifice animals in any ceremonial way to get atonement for sin. It's okay that we wear clothing made of more than 3 kinds of fabric. We're not unclean because of that. A Jewish person would be. So that's ceremonial law. Civil law would be this. If someone steals, I'm just totally hypothetical Old Testament law, right? If you were to steal someone's cow, you have to pay them back 2 cows, right? If a young lady is caught in adultery, this is the penalty. If someone commits murder, this is the penalty. There was a civil law God instituted for the nation of Israel, a governmental civil law. Are those necessarily the civil laws of America? Not at all, right? But now this is what happens though. God has a moral law that He offers and gives to the nation of Israel in the Old Testament. Do not lie. Do not steal. Do not commit adultery. Have no other gods before me. Do not bear false witness. Honor your father and mother. There are moral laws. Do not cheat. If there's a widow among you, help them. If there's a foreigner visiting, be hospitable. Just good, don't lie, good moral laws. Now this is what happens though. Often we'll say, well, that ceremonial law doesn't apply, so we scratch all of it. Well, that civil law isn't authoritative in America, so we scrap all of it. Now this is what's interesting. He alludes to it here. Jesus continually bolsters, substantiates these same moral laws all throughout the New Testament. In fact, even more so. You heard do not murder. I say don't even have hate in your heart. Right? You've been taught do not commit adultery. I say don't even lust. So Jesus upholds and even drives these moral laws to the heart condition more so than just outward obedience. So in the Old Testament, we can get a sense of God's moral law. Does that make sense? Anybody got a comment, question, gripe, complaint? Anything? You know, we can look in the Old Testament and get a sense of what pleases God, can't we? And what doesn't please God. Really, really fascinating. Next thing, we already said this essentially up here. The Old Testament presents doctrine in story form. It gives us a sense of what these terms mean in the New Testament, but also they're just evident in story form. That we can take a narrative approach to seeing doctrine. Again, God's sovereignty, His character, His love, redemption, Him being a just judge, jealous, the coming Messiah. The whole story of the New Testament says no one can do the deal but Jesus Christ. Nothing is good enough. There is no redemption in anyone but Him. So this full story culminates in the Messiah, Jesus Christ. That is a doctrine built into the Old Testament. What about this one? The depravity of man. Our sin nature. If you can read the Old Testament and come away thinking humans are righteous, whoa, we've missed it. You cannot help but see that men, prophet, priest, or king, all are replete and utter sinners, falling short from God's standard. The doctrine of sin is evident in story form in the Old Testament. What about the doctrine of worship? Didn't we see that in this story? They recognized God's steadfast mercy and responded with worship. Man, there's just a great story that gives us a dictionary. We could say, I don't want to tell you what worship is. Look at this story. Now don't you see what worship is? Man, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful doctrines presented in story form. Any thoughts? That's going to be so fun going through that. We could spend weeks on that one.